Good morning, everyone. Good to be here again. And for our meditation this morning, we're going to read another text. It's found in Exodus chapter 16, um, and it's on page 62 in the Old Testament section, chapter 16. It's actually another one of the readings for today. And it's just not in our liturgy today, but as you will see, it's related to what we just read in John. Um, so, chapter 16, Exodus, says the following. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining." And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." As far as verse 12 for now. As you might have noticed, this is somewhat related to the text that was just read in John chapter 6. Last week I was here also, and we spoke on the feeding of the 5,000, which is the first part of chapter 6 of John 6. These stories are related, obviously, because Jesus told the crowd in Galilee, he had just given them bread, just as the Israelites in the Old Testament had eaten bread. And Jesus is saying that, well, actually, it wasn't Moses that gave them bread. And as a matter of fact, this bread came from heaven, and you also need to have this bread that comes from heaven. And he says, I'm the bread, and I can give you life. So this has to do with food, eating. Not only that, in this particular text in Exodus, as other texts related to eating or drinking here in Exodus and the book of Numbers, it has also to do with complaining. The word complaining is here in these verses at least 8 times it appears to us. That's not exactly in the account in the gospel, but here we have 8 times in 13 verses the word complaining. It has to do with this complaining. I don't know if you live with somebody or knows somebody who complains a lot. Well, we tend to complain, exactly, actually. A few days ago, we might have complained that it was too cold. Now we might be complaining already that it's too hot. Can't take that. It's not that hot, but anyway, soon we're going to be complaining because, we can't sleep so well at night because it's too hot. Anyway, we tend to complain. We tend to not be satisfied with our situation. It becomes a little bit problematic when you are with someone who is always complaining. I worked once with somebody who, from, let's say, 5 words he said, he would, at least 4 words were cussing words. He would never say, give me that tool, give me that so-and-so tool, I mean, it gets to a point that you can't take it anymore. Well, interestingly, this chapter is talking about food, like I said, about feeding, and about the important thing about, God's providing for his people, but it also speaks of complaining. Let's remember the situation here. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. Up to, let's say chapter 14, they were in Egypt and preparing to cross the Red Sea. And they were just recently released. The first part of chapter 15, you have this song of victory, song of Moses, where they celebrate being away from Egypt, away from slavery. So in many senses, Egypt represented to them oppression, represented to them slavery, suffering. Now they're just walking out towards Sinai where God directed them. And actually, when you come to verse 22 in chapter 15, you'll have them walked 3 days journey. Just after 3 days, what happens? Verse 24, chapter 15, and the people complained against Moses. What would you have done? Let's say in modern times, if you were in a country where there's some situation, war situation, or some situation that you're desperately trying to get out of that country. You finally board the plane and you're heading home. What would be your feeling? Ooh, relief. I'm so glad. Seems as life would be easy from that point on. Well, that doesn't seem to be the experience here. After only 3 days, I mean, most of the people, actually all the people, grew up in Egypt. They grew up in a situation of oppression. They were slaves of the Egyptians. You would think people would be, super happy and perhaps dancing and singing and so on. Well, we're told that 3 days later they were complaining. You can say, okay, fine. They didn't have water to drink. I mean, that's a good reason for getting desperate. Chapter 16, as we read, it's they are in their second month, 15 days. So, about 45 days later, they are complaining. You're still complaining. So, in some sense, this passage, it talks not only about God's provision, but it talks about their complaint. So these seems to be two important things that we can notice here. Interestingly, like I said, Jesus multiplies the bread and feeds 5,000 people, as we saw in John 6. But he is now teaching the people that miracle they saw was not about them having food, not having to buy food, not having to work for food. It's not about that. It's about Jesus being the bread of life. And it refers back to this passage. True, when we look this story in Jesus' account, the crowd is not complaining exactly. But they saw the miracle, and they were very curious and very interested in Jesus, because after all, Jesus could solve a lot of problems for them. And but in a sense, in both cases, the teaching is the same. Jesus wants to lead those people to understand the meaning of that bread, that food, and to understand that he was going to satisfy their needs. In the book of Numbers, this situation will happen again, and it will especially be described in the book of Numbers as testing. The people were testing God many times, and testing God's love and compassion. And many times God will be vengeful of them. But I want to look at quickly how the complaining works, and how to avoid, in a sense, and what this shows and what this tells about us and about God. So what is interesting to me as I read this text is what made them complain. As I said, they had just experienced an extremely impressive redemption, liberation, salvation from a situation of oppression. Shortly after that, they're complaining. We can say, well, the immediate cause of their complaining is their basic needs: food and water. How do you live without, these basic needs? Water, food, especially in a journey, in a deserted area where there are no provision, natural provisions. So how are you going to be living in this situation? So you can say, well, I mean, they have some reason to if not complaining, at least call for, some provision and so on. But we can say hard times makes us uncomfortable, and sometimes even wishing we had done it differently. If you noticed, when they start complaining, what is their immediate reaction? Verse 3: if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Our tendency is to look back and think, back then it was better. I mean, it took them 45 days to miss slavery. Wow, there we had something to eat. Well, footnote here, we had to work hard for it. I mean, it was oppressive work, but, well, nevertheless, we had something to eat. It's interesting how we forget the hard times real quickly, and we only think the good times. We tend to idealize our former situation. Actually, I would say even this is very common in bicultural families. We are here, but we think that, oh, there it was better. I wish I was there. We tend to idealize the other country, the other culture. It's too hard here. I want to go back. Actually, those who work with bicultural families, they notice this, especially children that grew up in a different country from their parents' origin. They identify themselves as foreigners in that country, and they want to go back to their country. But that country is not their country. It's the country of their parents. And when they go back, they're in shock because that's not they don't identify themselves. So it's very common to always feel displaced. I don't belong. Oh, it's not good here. Let me go back. I go back. Oh, I wish I was there. And interesting, and this may have occurred to you, and not only when we're talking about different countries, but even different parts of the same country, is we miss food. How many times you had someone coming from the other country or from your original state, and you ask, "Bring me something." Well, I would guess that before you order, some fancy electronic stuff, you're probably going to order some food that you miss from that country. The Egyptians are missing the food they had in Egypt. Just by the way, it's interesting how many important situations, events in our biblical story has to do with eating, starting with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It has to do with food. They desired that food that God said they weren't allowed to eat. And a lot of important situations has to do with food, including the Passover that is established here in Exodus and also picked up by Jesus. It has to do with food. Why? Because it has to do with our basic needs. So, we can say that this complaining starts with a need or a frustration. This may not have to do with our bicultural background. Sometimes, a job, you get a job, you're in a new job, and you'd rather be in the other job, and so on. We tend to think that our last happier moment was the best, and we wish we were there again. I'm not exactly sure how the Israelites thought that the land of Egypt was their happier situation than the desert. You may think, wow, it's much better to be free than to be slaves. Everything else that you go through, it's nothing compared to that oppression. But here they actually tend to miss the food and not remembering maybe their suffering. Actually, in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, when a similar situation comes up, it says that they say like this, when they started complaining, if only we had meat to eat. Interesting here is they're not starving. They had food every day because they had the manna. God was giving them the food. They were just tired of their menu. They were tired of eating the same thing every day. And they were craving for meat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing. I mean, exaggerated there. No? We ate for free. Not exactly. They were building houses for Pharaoh. And although they mention meat and fish, they really remember the vegetable, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. They had plenty. They just didn't have what they wanted. They were missing the food. They failed to understand the freedom, the redemption. They, like we do that many times, they idealize the past. There it was better. And they failed to see what God was doing to them, the freedom, the redemption. And in a sense, they also failed to face the reality and look forward. Sometimes you may go through a change in your life, change of country, change of city, change of job, and so on. And in the beginning, you may have to go through hard times. Does that mean you have to go back? Not necessarily. Sometimes you have to face the reality and move forward. They seem to have had difficulty with this, and this will be a continuous thing here through the book of Exodus and then Numbers. But not all complaints lead, not all needs lead to complaint. Of course, needs are basic to our living, but not all of them lead to complaint. There's probably another cause here. Maybe fear, maybe sense of insecurity, maybe panic. The issue here is not we're hungry, we're thirsty. There are other things that they experience that they sort of panic. It seems to be caused by a lack of understanding of the whole picture. As the Lord provides for them, they should know that I am the Lord, verse 12 tells us. Because Moses says to them, okay, Lord told me that he will provide for you. But know this, that when you eat, when you take your food, you at least will recognize that I am the Lord your God. As we see, this repeated several times. So the issue is not their immediate need. The issue is that they needed to see that the Lord was their God. So in a sense, this is to teach them. This is, like I said, an important topic here in Exodus. And it's picked up in John. And as we said last week, John tells about Jesus' miracles. And his intention was to lead people to know or to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And as we just read in chapter 6, it's about Jesus being the bread. This is important, and this in other texts make it clear that the solution for the complaint is not only to meet our immediate need, but it's to be able to understand it. The Lord could meet every need they demanded. Still, they kept complaining. Interestingly, here in the book of Exodus in chapter 18, we see Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, meeting them at Sinai. And Jethro, who is not in Egypt, he did not go out of Egypt like the Israelites. He came to meet them and he heard the story. And he was able to, by just hearing the story, he was able to recognize it, to actually acknowledge, I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. So the complaining started with their basic needs. But more than that, it was because they failed to understand what the Lord was doing for them. Maybe you've been to situations similar to this. I actually remember an occasion I've been to countries in Africa a few times, but I was there once in a place different from where I had been before, and always been there for like 1 or 2 weeks teaching and so on. And this time I was there for 2 weeks. But for some reason, I was in a situation that was, I would call it probably a cultural shock, even though I had been to that country before. And I couldn't take, staying there too long. I was getting, almost panicking. A few days before I was scheduled to come back, I got an email from the secretary who had booked my flight and all that, saying, the airline contacted us and saying there's been a change in the flights to Sao Paulo, so we had to reschedule your flight. You're going to have to leave 1 day later and spend overnight in Johannesburg, South Africa, and then get to Sao Paulo, spend the night in Sao Paulo, because I lived in Paraná. I had to fly to Paraná. And so we had to reschedule, and the company had already rescheduled your flight. I said, I'm not going to stay here 1 more day in this place. So I went on the internet, was able to go on the internet to search for the flights, and suggested the person, I'm going to be done here and so on. I think I can leave 1 day earlier. I talked to the people who were hosting me there. I said, you think I can leave 1 day earlier? Anyway, I did in such a way that I was able to leave 1 day earlier, catch a flight in Johannesburg. I had to spend the night in Johannesburg. Catch a flight in Johannesburg and leave it, and the same day get the next day get to home. And I got back home, and I told the family, I'm never again going back to Africa. This is it for me. Well, it took 6 months for me to get another invitation to go to Africa. And then I guess 1 year later, I went there again. So sometimes we're in a situation that it's too much for us. We can't take it. Sometimes we fail to see what the Lord is doing. And apparently this is the situation with the Israelites. The good news is that they're not in Egypt. Bad news is that they have challenges of their, life in the wilderness. But this will tell us something about what the Lord is doing. Sometimes we fail to see what the Lord is doing in our lives. So here, I think one aspect that's very important, and again, is picked up by Jesus, is God's provision. It will show us who the Lord is. So in a sense, there's a positive note on all our situations. In a sense, this experience shows not only the Israelites' character, even our own human character, We tend to complain even against God, but it shows who God is. This is the other side of the story in a sense. It shows two things: God's provision, and it shows God's compassion. God's provision because, in a sense, they had to be dependent on the Lord. They were slaves before, and slavery, in a sense, brings security. I don't know exactly how they got their food, but they were known as uh, uh, cattle breeders. They had sheep and so on. Probably their meat came from there. And but they were busy enough working for Pharaoh. But supposedly, food was not an issue, right? And they changed that situation, and in the wilderness, of course, that would be an issue. They wouldn't be able to plant, they wouldn't be able to maybe raise their cattle, and so on. So they had to depend on the Lord, and probably this is what these stories in the wilderness teach us. They had to depend on the Lord. Well, the text we read in John, people got very happy because they had something to eat, and just imagine, oh, we don't have to work anymore. We're going to have Jesus, he's going to be our king, and he'll provide food for us every day. Well, maybe that was their expectation. But with that, Jesus wanted to show them who he was and who God was. He said, "Well, you came after me not because you're interested in what I have to say, but because you ate food." And he says, verse 28, "What must we do to perform the works of God?" Maybe they were expecting that they would be able to do that. Jesus answered, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." So they said to him, "What sign are you going to give us then, so that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing?" And then they bring this up. Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it's written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. And then Jesus answers them, "I'll tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." And they say, "Sir, give us this bread." And as we read in Exodus, back in Exodus, verse 15, chapter 16, verse 15, when the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it? What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." So in both stories, there is a sign of God's provision, but it's not just to meet our physical needs, but it's to meet one of our deeper needs, is the need of God, the human need of God. So Jesus is correctly understanding the story of the manna not just as a provision of physical provision, but also to meet the human need to reconcile with God. It's true, God do meet our needs just as He did with the Israelites. He did not let them go hungry. He did provide for their food. And it also speaks of God's compassion, because many times God was not very happy with their complaining, but he is compassionate. Even then, he does provide for them. Despite their complaining, God provides for them and is compassionate. So these experiences show something about the Lord, about God's character. But the solution for our frustrations and complaints is not just to meet our immediate needs, but it's also to look to God, to look to Jesus, to be filled by his presence. But there's a place, actually, that complaint is used. We see that in the book of Psalms, actually. Complaint prayers. They're prayers that are directed to God. In some ways, they seem to be very angry prayers, very rebellious prayers, accusing God of something and so on. We might not even have the courage to pray these prayers or pray like the psalmist prays. We call these complaint prayers. But they are prayers that are directed to God. They are directed to God himself. It's a prayer where we tell God our hurt, trusting that he is the only one that is able to bring us peace and bring us security and bring a solution. So do we have a reason? Do we have a motive to complain? Direct our complaints to God in prayer, that he may bring us peace. It's different from complaining to others about God, complaining that God is not being merciful to me, God is not looking after me, God is not, caring for my needs and so on. We should put our complaints in prayer to the Lord. And usually these prayers, as you read the book of Psalms and you find one of these prayers, normally these prayers end with a word of trust in God, confidence. It says, "Why, Lord? How long, Lord?" But it comes to a final word of trust. The Lord is my God. We complain when we're frustrated. We usually blame the circumstances, but honestly, it has to do with more with ourselves than the circumstances. Yes, circumstances many times are very hard for us to handle, but it has also to do with our own self and how we can see and understand what the Lord is doing in our lives. This then tells us that the solution is not only to change the circumstances, is what we mostly wish. Oh, if I did not have this job, I had a better job. Or, oh, if I lived somewhere else, or if I had this or that, experience, would be much better. So we tend to change our circumstances. Actually, someone said that most of our prayers are directed to changing our circumstances or even changing God. But our prayers will make great changes when God changes us. As much as changing circumstances. I mean, it's true. Many times I left a job because I couldn't stand. And I had challenges adapting to another situation. But, in the long run, I see it was positive. So many times, yes, we do have to make some changes. But ultimately, we need to come to terms with our own longings, cravings, needs, and our acknowledgement. The Lord is God. I am the Lord your God. So this story tells something about our human nature, and it tells something about God's provision and God's care. That the Lord may bless us. Amen.